The mansion was cold, meticulously clean like the owner himself. An elegant woman arrived like a light breeze, rearranging everything without making a sound. Her care revealed more than efficiency. It revealed presence. And where there had only been control before, something unexpected was born. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you are watching from. Let's begin. Manchester awoke under a sky laden with clouds that seemed to portend rain at any moment. Dry autumn leaves danced across the sidewalks of the historic quarter, pushed by an icy wind that cut through the skin of anyone venturing out onto the streets that Thursday morning. Michael Ashton adjusted the collar of his understated shirt and looked out the window of his apartment high up on Oakwood Avenue. From up there, the city seemed small, controllable, like the reports he signed daily. At 42, Michael had built an empire of social responsibility. The Ashton Foundation was nationally recognized for its life-transforming initiatives, from building schools in deprived communities to funding shelters for vulnerable people. His name was synonymous with philanthropy, his photo graced business magazines, and his agenda was always packed with commitments that moved millions of pounds. But that morning, he had blocked out 2 hours of his day for something completely unusual. His best friend, Richard Taylor, had insisted for weeks until Michael relented. A blind date. The idea seemed absurd for someone who planned every minute of his day with military precision, but Richard had been persuasive. You need to reconnect with real people, Michael. Your life has become just numbers and presentations. When was the last time you talked to someone without an agenda behind it? The words had echoed in Michael's mind for days until he finally agreed. The chosen location was the Golden Elm Cafe, a charming and discreet establishment in the heart of Manchester's Old Town. Michael knew the place well. It was one of his secret retreats, where he could sit unrecognized and watch life pass by through the misty window. The cafe's aged wooden facade had a nostalgic air, with plants hanging over the entrance and tall windows that let in the filtered light of the cloudy morning. When Michael parked his car 2 streets away, a precaution he always took to maintain anonymity, it was already 9:15. He walked slowly along the uneven sidewalks, observing the few passers-by who hurried with their bags and umbrellas. The smell of fresh bread came from a nearby bakery, mingling with the characteristic aroma of coffee emanating from the Golden Elm Cafe. It was then that he saw her for the first time. Across the street, under the faded awning of an abandoned commercial building, a woman stood. She held in her hands a piece of yellowed paper, clearly read and reread so many times that the folds seemed ready to tear. Her lips moved in silence, uttering words only she could hear. It wasn't an ordinary note, Michael realized. It was something handwritten, with careful penmanship, which she recited as if they were verses of a poem. The woman wore clothes that told stories of many winters. A frayed coat of an indefinable color, once blue but now leaning towards gray, enveloped her thin body. A worn scarf was wrapped around her neck, and the boots she wore had scuffed soles that betrayed long walks. Her brown hair was pulled back in a messy bun, with a few strands escaping and dancing in the wind. There was something in her face, however, that captured Michael's attention. A silent dignity, an upright posture despite her worn clothes, as if she refused to let life's circumstances bend her spine. Michael hesitated on the sidewalk, torn between entering the cafe and continuing to observe that intriguing scene. He had seen homeless people countless times. His foundation worked directly with this population, funding shelters and social reintegration programs. But there was something different about this woman. She wasn't begging. She wasn't holding a sign. She wasn't extending her hand to passers-by. She was just there, in her own world, reciting words that seemed to hold deep meaning. Finally deciding, Michael pushed open the door of the Golden Elm Cafe. The small bell above the entrance tinkled softly, announcing his arrival. The interior was cozy, with dark wooden tables scattered without much order, antique high-backed chairs and decor that mixed hanging plants with black and white photographs of Manchester's old streets. The smell of fresh coffee was even more intense inside, mixed with the aroma of toasted bread and carrot cake coming from the oven. Mr. George, the cafe owner, a grey-haired man with a trimmed mustache, nodded with a discreet smile. Michael was a known customer, although he always preferred the back tables, away from the main windows. He chose his usual spot, from where he could see the entrance door and also the street, through a small gap between the lace curtains. He ordered an espresso and a cheese bread, his usual order, and began to wait. Richard had said the person would arrive at 10 o'clock sharp. Michael glanced at the discreet wristwatch he wore. 10 minutes remained. He allowed himself to relax in the chair, observing the other customers. An elderly couple shared a slice of pie at the next table, talking softly about their grandchildren. Two young women laughed at something on their phones while drinking cappuccino. It was an ordinary morning at the Golden Elm Cafe. It was when he looked again through the curtain gap that Michael saw the woman from across the street carefully put the paper into her coat pocket and begin to cross. Her movements were slow, calculated, as if she were measuring each step. When she reached the cafe sidewalk, she stopped at the entrance, observing the interior through the display window. Michael noticed the hesitation in her eyes. She knew she wasn't welcome in that kind of establishment. She knew the disapproving glances, the polite but firm gestures that invited her to leave. Instead of entering, she sat on the doorstep, shrinking a little to occupy the least possible space. She brought her hands to her mouth and blew, trying to warm them with her own breath. The wind remained biting outside, and the sun stubbornly refused to appear between the dense clouds. Mr. George, who was preparing coffee behind the counter, noticed the woman's presence almost immediately. Michael saw the cafe owner's expression change, cordiality giving way to professional rigidity. The man dried his hands on his apron and began to walk towards the door. Michael knew that script. He had seen it happen dozens of times. A polite but firm approach, a request for the person to leave, perhaps even the offer of a coffee in a disposable cup to soften the rejection. But something inside Michael stirred before his brain could fully process the impulse. He rose from his chair, raised his hand, and called out loudly before Mr. George reached the door. "Excuse me, George, but I was expecting someone. I'll handle it." The cafe owner stopped mid-stride, surprised. He looked from Michael to the woman at the door and back to Michael. An expression of understanding crossed his face, though it was an incorrect understanding. He must have thought this was the person for the blind date arranged by Richard. With a nod, Mr. George returned to the counter, leaving Michael to handle the situation. The woman at the door had heard everything. She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting Michael's through the glass. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Michael saw surprise in those brown eyes, followed by cautious distrust. She knew how to recognize charity when she saw it, and her expression made it clear she wasn't sure if she wanted to accept it. Michael walked to the door and opened it. The cold wind rushed in, swaying the curtains and making the leaves of some plants dance. He looked at the woman and said, keeping his voice low and neutral without condescension, "The coffee in here is warm. That table in the back has space for 2 people." It wasn't an effusive invitation. There was no obvious pity in his voice. It was almost a statement of fact, as if he were merely mentioning something that already existed. The woman studied his face for a few more seconds, looking for signs of mockery or ulterior motives. When she found neither, she slowly rose from the step. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice hoarse but surprisingly firm. Michael considered the question. It was a good question. Why had he done it? "Because I hate to see people cold," he finally replied. "And because the coffee I ordered will get cold if I don't have someone to talk to while I drink it." It was a strange answer, and they both knew it. But there was a peculiar honesty in it that made the woman give a small nod. She entered the cafe, her steps cautious on the softly creaking wooden floor. Some customers looked up, their gazes ranging from curiosity to thinly disguised disapproval. The woman ignored them with a dignity that impressed Michael. She walked to the back table and sat in the chair opposite him, maintaining an upright posture despite the visible weariness on her face. "What's your name?" Michael asked after Mr. George, still confused but professional, brought another coffee and another cheese bread. "Claire," she replied, wrapping her hands around the warm cup without drinking immediately, just absorbing the heat. "Claire Miller." She pronounced the surname carefully, as if it was something valuable she carried with her. "I was someone. I still am. I just lost my postcode." The phrase took Michael by surprise. It wasn't self-pity. It wasn't an excuse. It was a declaration of existence, a reminder that an address doesn't define humanity. He remained silent for a moment, processing those words. "Michael," he finally said, extending his hand across the table. "Michael Ashton." Claire looked at the outstretched hand, then at his face. Something shifted in her expression, a slight curiosity replacing part of her guard. She briefly clasped his hand. Her skin was cold, rough, but her grip was firm. "What do you do, Michael Ashton?" she asked, finally bringing the cup to her lips and taking a small sip of coffee. It was a simple question, but Michael felt its weight. What did he tell people? That he was CEO of one of the largest philanthropic foundations in the north of the country? That his name was linked to dozens of social projects? That he moved millions in donations and social investments? All of it felt wrong at that moment, sitting opposite this woman who had lost her postcode but maintained her dignity. "I work with education and institutional support," he finally said. Technically, it wasn't a lie. The Ashton Foundation had strong arms in both areas. "I help connect resources to those who need them." Claire nodded slowly, as if evaluating whether that was true or a simplified version of something larger. "So you know the system," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "I do," Michael admitted. "Then you know the system is broken," Claire continued, biting a small piece of cheese bread, "full of good intentions and paperwork that leads nowhere." Michael could have been offended. He could have defended his work, cited statistics and success stories, but something in Claire's direct manner prevented him. "The system has flaws," he agreed. "Many of them. But you still work in it." Because giving up would be worse. Claire studied him for a long moment, her brown eyes piercing. Then, for the first time, a small smile touched her lips. "Interesting," she murmured. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who don't need to fill every second with words. Claire finished her coffee slowly, savoring each sip as if it was something precious. Michael watched, fascinated by the way she transformed that simple moment into something almost ritualistic. "What were you reading across the street?" he finally asked, remembering the yellowed paper. Claire paused, the cup halfway to her mouth. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she placed the cup back on the saucer and reached into her coat pocket, pulling out the carefully folded paper. She smoothed it over the table, revealing lines handwritten in faded blue ink. "It's a poem," she simply said. "I wrote it a long time ago." Michael leaned in a little to see better. The handwriting was beautiful, each word carefully formed, although the paper was yellowed and stained by time and humidity. "You write?" "I used to," Claire corrected, "when I had somewhere to write." "And what stops you now?" Claire looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise and something akin to respect. "You ask direct questions." "I try. Most people beat around the bush, or they don't ask anything, just look away." "I'm not most people," Michael said, and then realized how presumptuous that sounded. "Sorry, I didn't mean it like that." But Claire was smiling again, that small smile that subtly lit up her face. "No, you're not." She folded the paper again with the same care with which she had unfolded it. "What stops me is the lack of a quiet place. Paper I can get, pens too sometimes, but a place where I can sit and let the words flow without being chased away, that's harder." Michael felt something tighten in his chest. How many times had he complained about not having enough time to do things he enjoyed, and here was someone with all the time in the world, but without the basic space to exist. Before he could reply, the cafe door opened, and a woman entered, looking around with an uncertain expression. She was casually but neatly dressed, held her phone in her hand, and was clearly looking for someone. When her eyes landed on Michael, she hesitated, then began to walk towards him. Michael understood immediately. That was the person for the blind date, the person Richard had chosen for him to meet, and he was sitting at the table with Claire, creating a situation that would be, at the very least, awkward to explain. The woman stopped beside the table, her gaze alternating between Michael and Claire with evident confusion. "Michael Ashton?" she asked, uncertain. "Yes," Michael confirmed, feeling torn between explaining and simply letting the misunderstanding run its course. "I'm Patricia. Richard Taylor told me you'd be here." She cast a glance at Claire, clearly expecting some kind of explanation. Claire immediately began to stand up. "I was just leaving," she said, her voice returning to that neutral, distant tone. "No," Michael said, louder than he intended. Both Patricia and Claire looked at him in surprise. He took a deep breath, making a decision he knew Richard would question later. "Patricia, "I apologize, but I need to cancel our date. Something unexpected has come up." Patricia blinked, processing the information. She looked again at Claire, and Michael saw the moment she understood, or thought she understood. A nearly imperceptible expression of disdain crossed her face. "I see," she said coldly. "What a shame." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and left the cafe, the door slamming behind her. The silence that followed was dense. Claire stood by the table, looking at Michael with a mixture of confusion and something he couldn't identify. "You didn't have to do that," she finally said. "I know," Michael replied, and it was true. He didn't have to, but the idea of interrupting that conversation, that strange but genuine moment with Claire, to make polite blind date small talk with a stranger, felt wrong in a way he couldn't fully explain. Claire slowly sat back down. "Your friend is going to be angry with you." "Probably," Michael admitted. "He'll say I sabotaged his only chance to get me a normal social life." "And did you sabotage it?" Michael thought about the question. He looked at Claire, with her worn clothes and intelligent eyes, with her poem tucked into her pocket and her unwavering dignity. "No," he finally said. "I think I did exactly what I was supposed to do." Claire didn't answer immediately. She just watched him. And Michael had the strange feeling of being evaluated in a more profound way than any business interview had ever evaluated him. Finally, she nodded, as if she had reached some internal conclusion. "Then let's enjoy the warm coffee," she said, picking up the cup again, "before it gets cold and you regret your choice." Michael smiled, a genuine smile that rarely appeared on his face lately. "I don't think I'll regret it," he said. And at that moment, sitting in the back of the Golden Elm Cafe while the cold wind blew outside and the world went on its indifferent course, Michael Ashton and Claire Miller began a conversation that neither of them could have foreseen, a conversation that would change both their trajectories in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The weeks that followed that first meeting at the Golden Elm Cafe were, for Michael, a kind of silent awakening. He began to notice patterns in his own routine that had previously gone unnoticed. The endless meetings where numbers were discussed but people were forgotten. The impeccable reports that showed statistical impact but rarely captured real stories. The safe distance he maintained from the Foundation's fieldwork, preferring to coordinate from his office with a panoramic view. Claire appeared at the cafe irregularly. Sometimes days passed without Michael seeing her. Other times, she was there 3 mornings in a row. He never asked where she was when she didn't show up, and she never offered explanations. There was a tacit agreement between them to respect each other's spaces and silences. When they met, conversations flowed in unexpected ways. Claire had a peculiar way of seeing the world, a perspective shaped by the experience of being on the fringes of society, but at the same time, observing it from an angle few had the privilege or courage to access. She spoke about the people she met on the streets, about the invisible hierarchy that existed among those whom society saw as a homogeneous group. There were the newcomers, still in shock from the change in circumstances, the veterans who had developed complex survival strategies, the artists and poets like her who used creativity as a way to maintain sanity, the sick, the addicted, those who had simply given up. Michael listened, fascinated. Every conversation with Claire was like peeling back layers of a reality he thought he knew because of his work, but which he actually only observed from afar through spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. On a particularly cold June morning, when Manchester was enveloped in a dense fog that transformed the city into something almost ghostly, Claire arrived at the cafe visibly trembling. Her thin coat was no match for the harsh winter that was setting in. Michael watched her sit down, noticing how she tried to disguise the tremors, keeping her hands firmly wrapped around the cup of coffee that Mr. George, who now received her without question, had brought without her asking. They talked about trivial things that morning. Claire mentioned a street theatre group that had performed in Victoria Square, how their performances were raw but honest. Michael spoke about an art exhibition he had visited at the Whitworth Art Gallery, although he omitted the fact that his foundation was one of the event's sponsors. When the conversation naturally came to a comfortable pause and Claire stood to leave, Michael also stood. "Wait a moment," he said, taking off the coat he was wearing. It was a simple grey wool piece, but of good quality. "It's too cold out there." Claire looked at the coat, then at Michael. "I don't accept charity," she said, her voice firm but without hostility. "It's not charity," Michael replied, thinking quickly. I forgot I had another one in the car, and this one is making me too warm in here. It was a clumsy lie, and they both knew it. But there was something in the way Michael looked at her, without condescension or pity, just a basic human concern that made Claire hesitate. "You're a terrible liar," she finally said, but there was a trace of humor in her voice. "Probably," Michael admitted. Claire took the coat, feeling the weight of the quality wool between her fingers. For a moment, it seemed she would return it. Then she simply nodded, put it on over the thin coat she was already wearing, and left without another word. Michael sat back down, watching her disappear into the fog through the cafe window. Mr. George, who had observed the exchange, approached with more coffee. "You're a good man, Dr. Ashton," the cafe owner said softly. Michael turned quickly. "You know who I am." Mr. George smiled gently. "Of course, I recognized you the first time you came in here about 2 years ago. But you were looking for peace, not recognition, so I respected that." He paused. "And the young lady, she doesn't know, does she?" Michael shook his head slowly. "No." "Are you going to tell her?" It was a good question. Michael had asked himself the same question several times in recent weeks. "I don't know," he admitted. "Not yet." Mr. George nodded understandingly. Sometimes the truth waits for the right moment. Forcing it can break fragile things. He gave Michael a friendly pat on the shoulder and returned behind the counter. In the following days, Michael noticed Claire wearing the coat. She never mentioned it, never thanked him directly, but he saw the difference. She seemed a little less vulnerable to the cold, a little more protected. It was a small gesture, but it meant something to both of them. It was on a Monday afternoon, when the cafe was almost empty, that Claire shared more about her story. She never offered personal information voluntarily, and Michael had learned not to ask directly. But that day, something in her seemed more open, as if the words needed to come out. "I was a teacher," she suddenly said, interrupting a comfortable silence as they watched the fine rain begin to fall outside. "World literature. I taught at a private school here in Manchester." Michael looked up, surprised not by the information itself, but by the fact that Claire was sharing. He said nothing, just waited. "I loved teaching," she continued, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wooden table. Seeing students' eyes light up when they finally understood the beauty of a Frost poem, or when they could see the layers of meaning in Virginia Woolf. It was magical. "What happened?" Michael asked gently. Claire was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. "A series of bad choices, a relationship that fell apart badly, debts that accumulated when I tried to keep a home I could no longer afford on my own. And then, my mother's illness." She paused, took a deep breath. "I cared for her until the end. I used everything I had. And when she passed, I realized I had lost everything else too. My job because I missed too much work. My apartment because I couldn't pay for it. My friends because I pushed everyone away. Was there no one to help?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. "People help up to a point," Claire said with bitter wisdom. "Then they get tired, or they get uncomfortable. It's easier to walk away than to keep watching someone sink." Michael thought about all the Foundation's initiatives aimed at preventing situations like Claire's: emergency financial aid programs, guidance for families in crisis, community support networks. On paper, everything worked. In practice, people still fell through the cracks of the system. Claire was living proof of that. "Do you still write?" he asked, gently changing the subject. Claire smiled sadly. "When I can. I have a notebook I got from a shelter. I write at night when I find some lamplight or a minimally protected place. Poems, mainly. Sometimes small stories about the people I meet." "Have you ever thought about publishing?" The question made Claire laugh, a joyless sound. "Publish? How? I don't even have a working email address. No regular internet access. The publishing world isn't exactly accessible to those living on the streets." Michael didn't reply immediately. His mind was already working, thinking of possibilities, but he forced himself to stop. Claire didn't want solutions, she was just sharing her story. Sometimes listening was more important than solving. "I'd love to read your poem someday," he simply said. Claire looked at him with that penetrating expression she had, as if searching for lies or ulterior motives. When she found none, she nodded. "Maybe someday," she said. The weeks continued to pass, and Michael found himself readjusting his schedule to create spaces that allowed for his visits to the Golden Elm Cafe. He arrived earlier, left later, just to ensure he would be there on mornings when Claire might appear. Richard had only questioned him once about the disastrous date with Patricia, and Michael had been vague in his explanation. Something about bad timing and no connection. Richard had let the matter drop, though Michael could see the curiosity in his friend's eyes. It was during one of these mornings that Michael witnessed a different side of Claire. They were sitting at their usual table when a boy, no more than 10 years old, appeared at the cafe door with a stack of used books in his arms. It was clearly an attempt to earn some money by selling volumes he had probably found or been given. The boy entered timidly, approaching the tables with his books. Most customers dismissed the boy with quick gestures, not even looking at what he was offering. When he reached Michael and Claire's table, the latter stopped the boy with a gentle gesture. "Let me see what you have there," she said. The boy, surprised that someone was actually paying attention, began to show the books. There was a miscellany of titles, from cheap detective novels to some battered classics. Claire examined each one carefully, commenting on some, asking the boy if he had read any. The boy, clearly unaccustomed to this level of interest, began to open up, talking about his school, about how his mother always said reading was important. Michael observed the scene, touched by the way Claire treated the boy with genuine dignity and respect. When she finally selected a book, a worn copy of The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, she turned to Michael. She said nothing, but her eyes clearly communicated what her words did not. Michael understood. He took out his wallet and paid not only for the book Claire had chosen, but for the entire pile the boy was carrying. He tried to be discreet, but he saw Claire watching as he counted the notes. For a brief moment, she saw the flash of the black card Michael kept in his wallet before he quickly closed it. The boy left the cafe beaming, his pockets full of money and his arms light. Claire held the book, running her fingers over the worn cover. "You are generous," she said, her voice too neutral to be just an observation. "You chose the book," Michael replied, feeling a tension that wasn't there before. "But you paid with a card that probably has more credit than most people see in a year." So she had noticed. Michael felt his stomach clench. "Claire, You don't need to explain," she interrupted him, but there was something in her voice, a distance that wasn't there minutes ago. "Everyone has their secrets." "It's not a secret," Michael said quickly. I didn't want it to change things between us." "And does it?" Claire asked, her eyes fixed on his. "You tell me," Michael replied, returning her gaze. Claire was silent for a long moment. Finally she sighed. "I don't know. I'm still trying to understand who Michael Ashton really is." "I'm the same person who's been having coffee with you all these weeks," Michael said firmly. "That hasn't changed." Claire nodded slowly, but Michael could see that something had shifted between them, a small crack in the trust they had been building. She finished her coffee faster than usual and stood up. "I need to go," she said. Michael didn't try to stop her. He just nodded and watched her leave, taking the book with her. When the door closed, he let out a long sigh. Mr. George, who had observed everything from afar, approached silently and collected the empty cups. "Secrets always come to light," the cafe owner said gently. "The question is whether the trust built is strong enough to survive them." Michael hoped so. But for the first time since he had met Claire, he wasn't sure. The following days were strange. Claire continued to appear at the cafe, but there was a new caution in her. She observed Michael in a different way, as if she were re-evaluating every conversation they had had, every gesture he had made. Michael felt the change like a physical pain, but he didn't know how to fix it without fully revealing who he was. And he was afraid that this total revelation would completely destroy what they had built. It was on a rainy Thursday that everything definitively changed. Michael was leaving the cafe after a morning when Claire hadn't appeared, when a local journalist approached him on the sidewalk. The man recognized him immediately, greeting him effusively and asking about the inauguration of the new pediatric wing of St. Jude's Hospital, a project that the Ashton Foundation had almost entirely funded. Michael tried to be polite but brief, wanting to end the conversation quickly. But the journalist was enthusiastic, speaking loudly about the impact of the foundation's work, about how Dr. Ashton was an example of philanthropy in the city. Michael responded mechanically, his eyes scanning the street, looking for Claire, even though he knew she probably wasn't there. But she was. Across the street, partially hidden under a shop awning, Claire stood. And she had heard everything. Michael saw the exact moment comprehension crossed her face, the way her eyes widened slightly, how her posture stiffened, how she took a step back as if she had been dealt an invisible blow. "Dr. Ashton," the journalist was saying, "the whole city recognizes your work. The Ashton Foundation has been a real force for change." Michael barely heard. His eyes were fixed on Claire, trying to communicate something, anything, across the distance that separated them, but she was already turning, beginning to walk away. Michael quickly excused himself from the journalist and began to cross the street, but a bus passed at that moment, blocking his view. When he finally managed to cross, Claire had disappeared into the crowd gathering under the awnings, sheltering from the rain that was starting to fall harder. He stood on the sidewalk, the rain soaking his shirt, feeling as if he had lost something precious that he had barely begun to understand he possessed. The days that followed that rainy Thursday were the most difficult Michael had experienced in a long time. Not because of work pressure nor the daily challenges the foundation faced, but because of the absence. The absence of Claire at the Golden Elm Cafe, the absence of those meetings that had become the most real part of his day, the absence of someone who saw him as Michael, not as Dr. Ashton or the CEO of the foundation. He returned to the cafe every day, sometimes twice a day, hoping to see her. He sat at their usual table, drank his coffee, watched the door. Mr. George asked no questions, just served the coffee with an understanding look that somehow made everything worse. On the fifth day, without news of Claire, Michael made a decision. He needed to find her, needed to explain. But how to find someone who has no address, who lives between the city's spaces? He thought about using the foundation's resources, activating the network of shelters and support centers he helped fund. But that would seem like an invasion, an improper use of his power and resources. So he did something he had never done before. He went out to look for her personally. He started at Victoria Square, where Claire had mentioned seeing street theatre performances. Then he went to St. Peter's Square, where many homeless people gathered during the day. He walked through the streets of the historic quarter, looking at faces, searching for that grey wool coat he had given her. People looked at him with curiosity. This well-dressed man wandering with purpose, but no clear destination. It was only on the third day of searching that he finally obtained some information. An older man, sitting on the steps of Manchester Cathedral, stopped him when he saw Michael looking. "Are you looking for someone?" the man asked, his voice hoarse but gentle. Michael hesitated, but something in the man's expression made him trust him. "A woman named Claire Miller. She wears a grey coat, carries a notebook." The man nodded slowly. "I know Claire. She's a good sort, cultured, always respectful." He studied Michael for a moment. "You're the cafe chap, aren't you? She mentioned you, not by name, but by description." "Is she okay?" Michael asked, feeling a tightening in his chest. "I need to talk to her." The man was silent for a moment, as if deciding how much he should say. "She's in one of the shelters. She's unwell, nothing serious, but has a bad cold. The new shelter near the Central Market. But, young man," he paused meaningfully, "if you hurt her, perhaps it's best to leave her be." "I didn't mean to hurt her," Michael said, and it was the most honest truth he had spoken in days. I wasn't completely honest about who I am." The man gave a sad smile. "Ah, yes, the old problem of inconvenient truth. Well, if you go there, go with respect. Claire has pride, and wounded pride is hard to heal." Michael thanked him and followed the directions to the shelter. It was a renovated building with freshly painted walls and a facade that tried to be welcoming. Ironically, Michael knew that the Ashton Foundation had contributed to the renovation of that space 2 years ago. He had never visited personally, always receiving reports and photos by email. Now, standing at the entrance, about to enter not as the distant benefactor, but as someone looking for a specific person, seemed surreal. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a tired but kind expression, looked up when he entered. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Claire Miller," Michael said. "I was told she's staying here." The woman frowned. "Are you family?" "No, I'm a friend." "The rule is that only family can visit in the rooms," she began, but then stopped, studying Michael more closely. He saw recognition cross her eyes. "Wait, you're Dr. Ashton, aren't you? From the foundation?" Michael felt his stomach sink. He didn't want his position to make things easier this time. He wanted to be just Michael, Claire's friend. But he nodded. "I am." The woman's expression changed immediately, becoming more deferential. Of course, of course. What an honor to have you here, Doctor. The Foundation has done so much for this place. Claire is on the second floor, room 16. She has a bad flu, but she's already getting better. Michael climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The second-floor corridor was clean but sad, with numbered doors on each side. He found room 16 and stopped in front of it, his hand raised to knock but hesitating. What was he going to say? How to explain that he had kept his identity secret, not out of shame for her, but out of a desire to be seen simply as himself, without the weight of his name and the Foundation? How to make her understand that the moments in the cafe had been the most genuine he had experienced in years? Before he could decide, the door opened. An older woman was coming out, carrying a basin of water. She looked at Michael with curiosity. "Are you looking for someone?" "Claire Miller," Michael said. The woman nodded towards the room. "She's in there, but she's resting. She had a difficult night with the cough." Michael thanked her, and before he could change his mind, entered. The room was small, with 4 cramped bunk beds. Only one was occupied. Claire was lying on the bottom bunk in the corner, facing the wall, wrapped in thin blankets. He could hear her breathing, punctuated by an occasional cough. "Claire," he said softly. She remained motionless for a moment, then slowly turned. Her eyes were reddish, whether from illness or tears or both, Michael couldn't tell. When she saw him, something crossed her face: surprise, anger, perhaps even a flicker of something that could be relief before it was quickly suppressed. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was hoarse, difficult to hear. "I was worried," Michael said. "You disappeared, and you found me." It wasn't a question, but an accusation. "Of course you found me. Dr. Ashton, the great philanthropist, can find anyone in his city. After all, your resources reach every corner, don't they?" The words cut, but Michael accepted them. He deserved her anger. "May I sit?" he asked, indicating the empty bed beside her. "I suppose you can do whatever you want. This place exists because of you, doesn't it?" Michael sat down anyway, maintaining a respectful distance. "Yes, the Foundation helped fund the renovation, but I had never been here before." "How convenient," Claire said, her voice laden with sarcasm. "Keeping your distance from the people you help. Easier to see numbers on spreadsheets than to look into the eyes of those who truly suffer." "You're right," Michael simply said. The admission seemed to disarm Claire a little. She expected him to defend himself, to justify his distance. "I'm right," she repeated distrustfully. "You are absolutely right," Michael continued. "I hid behind reports and meetings. I convinced myself I was making a difference by keeping my distance, by being professional. But the truth is, I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Claire asked, her voice a little less harsh. "Afraid of seeing that the problem is bigger than any solution I can offer. Afraid of feeling powerless. Afraid of realizing that despite all the millions the Foundation moves, there are still people falling through the cracks of the system." He paused, took a deep breath. "Afraid of truly connecting and realizing that I am as flawed as any system I tried to build." Claire was silent, processing his words. Finally, she sat up on the bed, her back against the wall. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" "Because when I'm with you, I'm just Michael," he replied. "Not the CEO, not the philanthropist, not the guy everyone wants to impress or wants something from. Just a man having coffee and real conversations. And I didn't want to lose that." "You didn't lose it," Claire said softly. "You lied about it." "I didn't lie. I just omitted parts." "It's the same thing when the omission changes everything," Claire retorted. "Do you think I would have talked to you the same way if I had known? Do you think I would have accepted your coat or sat in that cafe if I had known you were the guy whose name is on all the shelter brochures, the man who decides who gets help and how much?" "I don't decide that alone," Michael began, but Claire interrupted him. "It doesn't matter. You have power, real power. And I'm just another beneficiary of your charity, another potential success story for your annual reports." "You were never that to me," Michael said vehemently. "Never. You are the person who made me question everything, who made me leave my office and walk the streets of my own city, who showed me that humanity doesn't fit into spreadsheets." Claire watched him with that penetrating gaze she had, the one that seemed to read truths people tried to hide. Michael let her look, not averting his eyes, letting her see whatever she wanted to see. "I can't do this," Claire finally said. her voice breaking a little. "I can't be your redemption project. I can't be the person who makes you feel better about your choices and your privilege." "I'm not asking for that," Michael said. "I'm just asking that you don't give up on our friendship because of who I am on paper." "But who you are on paper matters," Claire insisted. "It matters when you can change the lives of hundreds of people with a signature. It matters when your black card buys in seconds what would take me months to get. It matters when you can walk away from this conversation and go back to your comfortable life while I stay here, sick, in this shared room." The brutal truth of Claire's words hung between them. Michael wanted to argue, wanted to say that things were more complicated than that. But she was right. The difference between them wasn't just circumstantial, it was structural, systemic, and no amount of shared coffees would change that. "So what do we do?" Michael finally asked. "Because I don't want to give up. But I also don't want you to feel obligated to anything." Claire coughed, a harsh sound that made her wince. Michael instinctively moved as if to help her, but stopped when he saw her expression. She didn't want his physical help. When the cough passed, she cleared her throat painfully. "I need time," she said. "I need to think about what all this means, about whether I can trust you again, about whether I want to." Michael nodded, although every part of him wanted to protest, wanted to fix things immediately. "How much time do you need?" "I don't know," Claire replied honestly. "Maybe a few days, maybe longer. Maybe I'll decide it's better to keep our distance." The possibility of completely losing that connection made something tighten in Michael's chest, but he forced himself to nod. "I will respect that. But Claire," he waited until she looked him in the eyes, "please believe that what I felt, what I feel when we are together is real. It doesn't matter how much money I have in the bank or what position I hold. Those moments in the cafe, those conversations, those times were the most real I've lived in years." Claire didn't answer. She just watched him for a long moment before turning back to the wall, clearly signaling that the conversation was over. Michael slowly stood, feeling the weight of each movement. Before leaving, he noticed a small bag beside her bed. Silently, he took a small box from his pocket that he had brought with him. It contained flu medicine and some tea sachets. He left it on the small table beside the bed without saying anything, and left. In the corridor, he stopped, leaning against the wall, closing his eyes. The receptionist had seen him as Dr. Ashton, the benefactor. Claire had called him a liar, someone using his privilege to feel better. Who was right? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps the truth was more complicated than any label could capture. He went down the stairs and out of the shelter into the biting cold of the Manchester afternoon. The streets were full of hurried people, each with their own problems and stories. Michael walked without a specific direction, letting his feet lead him. He passed the Golden Elm Cafe but didn't go in. The place seemed different now, haunted by memories of conversations that might never happen again. In the days that followed, Michael tried to respect Claire's request for space, but it was difficult. He found himself thinking about her at random moments during important meetings, wondering if she was better, if the flu had passed, if she had read the poems she mentioned wanting to write. He avoided going to the cafe, not wanting to seem like he was trying to force a meeting. A week passed, then two. Michael's routine superficially returned to normal, but something fundamental had changed within him. He began to personally visit the Foundation's projects, not just the inauguration events with photographers and speeches, but the day-to-day operations. He sat with educators in schools the Foundation supported, talked to social workers in the shelters, listened to stories of people who were rebuilding their lives. Each story reminded him of Claire, of her dignity, her refusal to be defined solely by her circumstances. He began to see patterns that the reports never captured, the bureaucracy that prevented people from accessing help, the requirements that excluded precisely the most vulnerable, the rules made by well-intentioned people, but distant from the reality of the streets. And then, on a cold Saturday morning, 3 weeks after his last conversation with Claire, Michael made a decision. He wrote a letter. Not an email, not a text message, but a handwritten letter on good quality paper. In it, he didn't apologize again. He didn't try to explain himself further. He simply wrote about what he had learned since they last saw each other, about the people he had met, the stories he had heard, about how she had changed his perspective in ways he was still discovering. In the end, he simply wrote, "If you still want to share the silence, I'll be at the Golden Elm Cafe Saturday at 10 o'clock. No promises, just presence. He put the letter in a plain envelope with no external identification. Then he did something he had never done. He returned to the shelter and left the envelope with the receptionist, asking her to give it to Claire. He didn't use his full name, didn't mention the foundation. He just said it was from a friend. Now, sitting in the cafe that Saturday morning, with 2 steaming cups of coffee on the table in front of him, Michael waited. He didn't know if Claire would come. He didn't know if she had even read the letter, but he was there, as he had promised, offering presents without expectations. The cafe door opened and closed several times. Each time Michael looked hopeful, but it wasn't her. Mr. George passed by the table, refilling his cup silently, a wordless gesture of support. It was almost 11 o'clock when Michael began to accept that Claire wouldn't come. He had offered what he could, and she had made her choice. He needed to respect that, no matter how much it hurt. He was preparing to leave when the door opened once more, and this time it was her. Claire stood at the entrance, her hair tied in the same messy bun, wearing the grey coat he had given her. Her eyes searched the cafe until they found Michael. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Claire began to walk towards the table. Each step seemed measured, deliberate. When she arrived, she said nothing, just sat in the chair opposite him. Michael pushed one of the cups towards her. The coffee was still warm. Claire looked at the cup, then at Michael, and then, for the first time in weeks, she smiled. A small, cautious, but genuine smile. "You waited," she simply said. "I said I would," Michael replied. Claire picked up the cup, wrapping her hands around it. "I read your letter, read it several times. And I realized that maybe you're not the man I thought you were when I discovered your identity. But you're also not exactly the man I first met at the cafe." She paused. "Maybe you're both. And maybe that's more complicated, but also more honest." Michael felt something release in his chest. "I'm trying to figure out how to be both without losing myself in either," he admitted. "Then perhaps we can figure that out together," Claire said. "But with some rules." "Rules?" "Complete honesty, no omissions, and no trying to save me or make me your personal project. If we're going to do this, whatever this is, it has to be as equals, even if our circumstances are different." Michael nodded immediately. "I agree to all terms." Claire finally drank her coffee, and the two were silent for a moment. It was different from the comfortable silences they had shared before. This one had layers of caution, of unanswered questions, of trust being rebuilt brick by brick. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, Michael thought, as he watched Claire gradually relax in her chair, a beginning is all we need. The rebuilding of trust didn't happen overnight. In the first meetings after their reconciliation, there was a cautious formality between Michael and Claire, like two strangers learning to know each other again, but this time without masks. Claire asked direct questions about his work, about the foundation, about how decisions were made. Michael answered with honesty, sometimes admitting flaws and frustrations he had never shared with anyone. "You know what bothers me most?" he said on one of those mornings, stirring his coffee distractedly. "It's that no matter how hard we try, there are always more people needing help than there are resources available. So we end up having to choose. And how do you choose who to help? How do you decide that this school is more important than that shelter? That this education project is worth more than that mental health program? I hate having to make those choices." Claire watched him as he spoke, and for the first time since they had reconnected, her expression completely softened. "So you also feel powerless," she said, not as an accusation, but as understanding. "You just have a different kind of powerlessness than mine." "Not as different as I thought," Michael admitted. It was in that conversation that something fundamental changed. They stopped seeing their differences as insurmountable barriers and began to see them as complementary perspectives. Claire intimately knew the problems Michael tried to solve from afar. Michael had access to resources and systems that could amplify the solutions Claire perceived from her unique position. One morning, Claire brought her notebook covered in brown paper. "You said you wanted to read my poems," she said, pushing the notebook across the table with visible hesitation. It was an act of significant vulnerability, and they both knew it. Michael took the notebook with reverence, feeling the weight not of the object but of what it represented. Claire was trusting him again, sharing something deeply personal. He opened the pages, seeing the careful handwriting he recognized from the first day, when he saw her reciting across the street. The poems were extraordinary, not for perfect technique or elaborate rhymes, but for their raw honesty and the beauty found in unlikely places. She wrote about the loneliness of crowds, about the dignity of the forgotten, about small gestures of humanity amidst the cold concrete of the city. Each word seemed to have been carefully chosen, polished like a precious stone found amidst the gravel. "Claire," Michael said after reading several poems, "these are incredible. Have you ever thought about publishing them?" "We've had this conversation," Claire replied with a half smile. "It's not exactly simple when you don't have access to anything." "What if there was a way?" Michael asked, but raised his hand before she could protest. "I'm not talking about paying to publish or using my contacts. I'm talking about something different." Claire watched him cautiously. "Go on." "The foundation funds writing workshops in some community centers. But I was thinking of expanding, creating spaces where people like you, who have stories and talents but lack platforms, can develop their work with guidance from professional writers, access to computers, opportunities to present their work." "That sounds suspiciously specific to my needs," Claire said, raising an eyebrow. "Because you made me think of it," Michael admitted. "But it's not just about you. There are dozens, probably hundreds of people in this city with talents that will never be seen because they don't have the right tools or opportunities. Why not change that?" Claire was silent, processing. "Are you serious?" "Completely. I've already talked to some board members of the foundation. They're interested. Of course, it would take time to implement, but we could start small. A pilot workshop perhaps here in the historic quarter." "No strings attached," Claire said, her voice firm. "If I participate, it's because I want to, not because I feel obligated." "No strings attached," Michael agreed. "And if you decide you don't want to participate, the project will happen anyway, because it's a good idea regardless of you." Claire nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll think about it." In the following weeks, the literary workshop project began to take shape. Michael got personally involved in a way he rarely did with the Foundation's initiatives. He visited community centers, talked to educators, interviewed local writers who could be facilitators, and most importantly, he listened to the people who would be impacted by the project, asking what they truly needed instead of assuming he knew. Claire, cautiously at first, began to attend the initial planning sessions. Her perspective was invaluable. She pointed out barriers no one else had considered. "Do you realize that if the workshops are held at night, many people won't be able to participate because shelters have entry curfews?" she said in a meeting. "And if you require some form of identification for registration, you'll be excluding precisely those who need it most." The Foundation's team, initially surprised to have someone with lived experience of homelessness actively participating in the planning, quickly came to value her contributions. Michael watched with silent pride as Claire, who weeks ago was trembling with cold on the cafe doorstep, now sat confidently at a meeting table, making observations that fundamentally changed how the project would be structured. It was during one of these meetings that Rachel, the Foundation's educational programs coordinator, pulled Michael aside. "She's remarkable," Rachel said, watching Claire interact with other team members. "Are you thinking of bringing her onto the permanent staff? We could use someone with that perspective on other projects." Michael hesitated. It was exactly the kind of thing Claire had asked him not to do, to try to save her with a job offer, but at the same time it was genuinely a good idea. "Let me talk to her first," he said, "but it needs to come from you, not from me. And it needs to be real, not disguised charity." Rachel agreed, and a few days later approached Claire directly with a proposal. It would be a project consultant position, focused on ensuring that the Foundation's initiatives were truly accessible and relevant to the populations they aimed to serve. The salary wasn't huge, but it was fair. And more importantly, it came with genuine respect for her expertise. Claire took a week to respond. She talked to Michael about it, but made it clear that the decision would be hers. "I need to know that if I accept, it's because I deserve the position, not because we're friends," she said. "Rachel wouldn't make the offer if she didn't think you'd add value," Michael assured her. "And she's not the type to do favors. If she wants you on the team, it's because she sees your potential." Finally, Claire accepted. And with the acceptance came a series of changes. The Foundation helped connect her with affordable housing programs. It wasn't instantaneous. It wasn't magical. But gradually, Claire began to rebuild structures she had lost. A small apartment in the Didsbury neighborhood, a routine, an address. "I finally have a postcode again," she told Michael with an ironic smile during one of their morning coffees, which continued to be a constant, despite all the changes. But perhaps the most significant transformation was the first public reading Claire organized. The literary workshop had grown beyond initial expectations, attracting not only vulnerable people, but also other local writers curious about the project. Claire proposed holding an event where workshop participants could share their work with a wider audience. The reading was scheduled for a Friday evening, in a cultural space in the historic quarter. Michael arrived early, helping to arrange chairs, but trying to stay in the background. This was Claire's and the other participants' night, not his. The space began to fill. People came from all walks of life, from university students to middle-aged professionals, from other artists to the curious. Michael recognized some faces he had seen on the streets during his walks after meeting Claire. They were neatly dressed, nervous, holding crumpled papers with their poems and stories. Claire opened the evening. She stepped onto the small makeshift stage, and Michael noticed her hands trembled slightly as she held the microphone. But when she began to speak, her voice was firm. "Good evening, everyone," she said. "Welcome to the first open reading of the Streets and Stories writing workshop. This project was born from a simple but radical idea that everyone has a story that deserves to be heard, regardless of where they sleep at night or how much money they have in the bank." She paused, her eyes searching for Michael in the crowd. When she found him, she gave a small nod. "Someone once told me that I was still someone, even after losing my postcode. Tonight is about proving that this is true not just for me, but for everyone who shares this experience." What followed was an extraordinary evening. One by one, the participants came up to share their work. There were poems about loss and resilience, stories about small victories and great defeats, acute observations about society seen from angles most people never experience. Some readers stumbled over their words, nervous. Others spoke with surprising confidence. But all were met with genuine and respectful applause. When it was Claire's turn to read, she chose a new poem, one she had written specifically for that night. It was about unexpected encounters, about how people enter our lives at the most improbable moments, about how humanity can flourish in the most unexpected spaces. She didn't mention the cafe. She didn't mention Michael directly, but he knew, and by the emotion in her voice as she read the last lines, he knew that she also knew how much that initial encounter had changed both of them. After the reading, during the socialization time with coffee and biscuits, Michael observed Claire interact with the participants and the audience. She was radiant, laughing and talking, completely in her element. Some people sought her out specifically, saying her poems had touched something deep within them. Other participants hugged her, thanking her for creating that space. "You've done an incredible thing here," a voice said beside Michael. It was Mr. George from the Golden Elm Cafe who had come for the reading. "That woman there, she was skin and bones, trembling on my doorstep a few months ago. Look at her now." "She did this herself," Michael said, watching Claire. "I just opened some doors." "Sometimes opening doors is all people need," Mr. George wisely replied. "But you had to learn to open them without pushing. And that's not easy for someone used to having the power to change everything with a signature." Michael nodded, recognizing the truth in the words. He had learned a lot since that cloudy morning when he first saw Claire across the street. He learned that solving problems doesn't always mean having all the answers. Sometimes it means listening, learning, and creating spaces for people to find their own solutions. He learned that privilege brings responsibility, but that responsibility doesn't mean control. And most importantly, he learned that the most genuine human connections happen not when we try to help someone, but when we recognize our shared humanity. In the months that followed, the literary workshop grew and multiplied. Other cities expressed interest in replicating the model. Claire became not only a valuable consultant for the foundation, but also a respected voice in social and cultural activism circles. Her name began to circulate not as the formerly homeless person who recovered, but as Claire Miller, poet and activist, someone whose words carried weight and whose perspective mattered. Michael, in turn, fundamentally transformed how he ran the foundation. He began to demand that all projects include consultation from people with lived experience in the issues they were trying to address. Board meetings, once dominated by PowerPoint presentations and financial discussions, now frequently included real stories from people impacted by the programs. Not everyone in the organization liked the changes. Some older board members found everything too emotional and unprofessional. But Michael stood firm. And when the results began to appear, with programs having a deeper and more sustainable impact, even the skeptics began to be convinced. The meetings at the Golden Elm Cafe continued to be a constant, an anchoring point amidst the changes. Sometimes they talked about work, but often about completely unrelated things: books they were reading, interesting news, random observations about the city. Their friendship had deepened beyond the dramatic circumstances of its beginning, becoming something solid and reliable. On a Saturday morning, almost a year after that first meeting, they were sitting at their usual table when Claire pulled an envelope from her bag. "I wanted to show you something," she said, passing the envelope across the table. Michael opened it and found a letter from a small but respected publisher in Manchester. They were interested in publishing a collection of Claire's poems. It wouldn't be a bestseller, but it would be real, it would be legitimate, it would be hers. "Claire, this is incredible," Michael said, genuinely moved. "Are you going to accept?" "I already have," she replied with a smile. "But I wanted you to be the first to know because, well, none of this would have happened if you hadn't invited me in that day, if you hadn't dared to look at someone most people ignore." Michael shook his head. "You would have found your way regardless. Talent like yours doesn't stay hidden forever." "Perhaps," Claire conceded, "but perhaps not. Life on the streets is hard. It breaks people. I was starting to break too, until I found a reason to believe it was still worth trying." They were silent for a moment, the weight of the journey they had shared hanging between them. It hadn't been easy. It had been complicated, sometimes painful, full of misunderstandings and difficult lessons, but it had been real. And it had been worth it. "You know what's funny?" Michael finally said. "When my friend Richard convinced me to accept that blind date, I was going reluctantly. I thought it would be a waste of time, and in a way, it was. I completely missed the date that was supposed to happen. But you gained another," Claire completed. "I gained another," Michael confirmed. "A much better one that changed me in ways I'm still discovering." Claire reached her hand across the table, and Michael took it. It wasn't romantic, nor dramatic. It was just two human beings recognizing the connection they had built, brick by brick, conversation by conversation over difficult and transformative months. "So where do we go from here?" Claire asked. "Wherever you want to go," Michael replied. "I'm just happy to be a part of the journey." Across the cafe, Mr. George observed the scene with a satisfied smile. He had seen many stories unfold in his establishment over the years, but this one was special. It was a story about improbable encounters, about looking beyond surfaces, about having the courage to truly connect with another human being, despite all differences and barriers. It was a story about humanity rediscovered in a city that sometimes seemed to have forgotten the value of each individual. And it was a story that was far from over. It was just the beginning of many others.